Chapter 3. Theory of Force Continuation. But let us look a little more closely at this omnipotent force of Herr Düring's. Crusoe enslaved Friday, quote, sword in hand. But where did he get the sword? Even on the imaginary islands of the Robinson Crusoe epic, swords have not, up to now, been known to grow on trees. And Herr Düring provides no answer to this question. If Crusoe could procure a sword for himself, we are equally entitled to assume that one fine morning, Friday might appear with a loaded revolver in his hand. And then this whole force relationship is inverted. Friday commands, and it is Crusoe who has to drudge. We must apologize to the readers for returning with such insistence to the Robinson Crusoe and Friday story, which properly belongs to the nursery and not to the field of science. But how can we help it? We are obliged to apply Herr Düring's axiomatic method conscientiously, and it is not our fault if in doing so we have to keep all the time within the field of pure childishness. So then the revolver triumphs over the sword, and this will probably make even the most childish axiomatician comprehend that force is no mere act of the will, but requires the existence of very real preliminary conditions before it can come into operation, namely instruments, the more perfect of which gets the better of the less perfect. Moreover, that these instruments have to be produced, which implies that the producer of more perfect instruments of force, vulgo arms, gets the better of the producer of the less perfect instruments. And that, in a word, the triumph of force is based on the production of arms, and this in turn on production in general, therefore on economic power, on the economic situation, on the material means which force has at its disposal. Force nowadays is the army and navy, and both, as we all know to our cost, are devilishly expensive. Force, however, cannot make any money. At most it can take away money that has already been made, and this does not help much either, as we have seen, also to our cost, in the case of the French milliards. In the last analysis, therefore, money must be provided through the medium of economic production. And so, once more, force is conditioned by the economic situation, which furnishes the means for the equipment and maintenance of the instruments of force. But even that is not all. Nothing is more dependent on economic prerequisites than precisely army and navy. Armament, composition, organization, tactics, and strategy depend above all on the stage reached at the time in production and on communications. It is not the, quote, free creations of the mind of generals of genius that have had a revolutionizing effect here, but the invention of better weapons and the change in the human material, the soldiers. At the very most, the part played by generals of genius is limited to adapting methods of fighting to the new weapons and combatants. At the beginning of the 14th century, gunpowder came from the Arabs to Western Europe, and, as every schoolchild knows, completely revolutionized the methods of warfare. The introduction of gunpowder and firearms, however, was not at all an act of force, but a step forward in industry, that is, an economic advance. Industry remains industry, whether it is applied to the production or the destruction of things. And the introduction of firearms had a revolutionizing effect not only on the conduct of war itself, but also on the political relationships of domination and subjection. The procurement of powder and firearms required industry and money, and both of these were in the hands of the burghers of the towns. From the outset, therefore, firearms were the weapons of the towns, and of the rising town-supported monarchy against the feudal nobility. The stone walls of the noblemen's castles, hitherto unapproachable, fell before the cannon of the burghers, and the bullets of the burghers' arquebuses pierced the armor of the knights. With the defeat of the nobility's armor-clad cavalry, the nobility's supremacy was broken. With the development of the bourgeoisie, infantry and artillery became more and more the decisive types of arms compelled by the development of artillery. The military profession had to add to its organization a new and entirely industrial subsection, engineering. The improvement of firearms was a very slow process. The pieces of artillery remained clumsy, and the musket, in spite of a number of inventions affecting details, was still a crude weapon. It took over 300 years for a weapon to be constructed that was suitable for the equipment of the whole body of infantry. It was not until the early 18th century that the flintlock musket with a bayonet finally displaced the pike in the equipment of the infantry. The foot soldiers of that period were the mercenaries of princes. They consisted of the most demoralized elements of society, rigorously drilled, but quite unreliable, and only held together by the rod. They were often hostile prisoners of war who had been pressed into service. The only type of fighting in which these soldiers could apply the new weapons was the tactics of the line, which reached its highest perfection under Frederick II. The whole infantry of an army was drawn up in triple ranks in the form of a very long, hollow square, and moved in battle order only as a whole. At the very most, either of the two wings might move forward or keep back a little. This cumbrous mass could move in formation only on absolutely level ground, and even then only very slowly, 75 paces a minute. A change of formation during a battle was impossible, and once the infantry was engaged, victory or defeat was decided rapidly and at one blow. In the American War of Independence, these unwieldy lines were met by bands of rebels, who, although not drilled, were all the better able to shoot from their rifled guns. They were fighting for their vital interests, and therefore they did not desert like the mercenaries. Nor did they do the English the favor of encountering them also in line and on clear, even ground. They came on in open formation, a series of rapidly moving troops of sharpshooters under cover of the woods. Here the line was powerless and succumbed to its invisible and inaccessible opponents. Skirmishing was reinvented, a new method of warfare which was the result of a change in the human war material. What the American Revolution had begun, the French Revolution completed, also in the military sphere. It also could oppose to the well-trained mercenary armies of the coalition only poorly trained but great masses of soldiers, the levy of the entire nation. But these masses had to protect Paris, that is, to hold a definite area, and for this purpose, victory in open mass battle was essential. Mere skirmishes would not achieve enough. A form had to be found to make use of large masses, and this form was discovered in the column. Column formation made it possible for even poorly trained troops to move with a fair degree of order, and moreover with greater speed, 100 paces and more in a minute. It made it possible to break through the rigid forms of the old line formation, to fight on any ground, and therefore even on ground which was extremely disadvantageous to the line formation, to group the troops in any way if in the least appropriate, and, in conjunction with attacks by scattered bands of sharpshooters, to contain the enemy's lines, keep them engaged, and wear them out until the moment came for masses held in reserve to break through them at the decisive point in the position. This new method of warfare, based on the combined action of skirmishers and columns, and on the partitioning of the army into independent divisions, or army corps, composed of all arms of the service, a method brought to full perfection by Napoleon in both its tactical and strategical aspects, had become necessary primarily because of the changed personnel, the soldiery of the French Revolution. Besides, two very important technical prerequisites had been complied with. First, the lighter carriages for field guns, constructed by Gribeauval, which alone made possible the more rapid movement now required of them, and secondly, the slanting of the butt, which had hitherto been quite straight, continuing the line of the barrel. Introduced in France in 1777, it was copied from hunting weapons and made it possible to shoot at a particular individual without necessarily missing him. But for this improvement, it would have been impossible to skirmish with the old weapons. The revolutionary system of arming the whole people was soon restricted to compulsory conscription, with substitution for the rich, who paid for their release, and in this form it was adopted by most of the large states on the continent. Only Prussia attempted, through its Landwehr system, to draw to a greater extent on the military strength of the nation. Prussia was also the first state to equip its whole infantry, after the rifled muzzle loader, which had been improved between 1830 and 1860 and found fit for use in war, had played a brief role, with the most up-to-date weapon, the rifled breech loader. Its successes in 1866 were due to these two innovations. The Franco-German War was the first in which two armies faced each other both equipped with breech-loading rifles, and moreover both fundamentally in the same tactical formations as in the time of the old smoothbore flintlocks. The only difference was that the Prussians had introduced the company column formation in an attempt to find a form of fighting which was better adapted to the new type of arms. But when, at Saint-Privat on August 18, the Prussian Guard tried to apply the company column formation seriously, the 5 regiments which were chiefly engaged lost in less than 2 hours more than a third of their strength, 176 officers and 5,114 men. From that time on, the company column 2 was condemned as a battle formation, no less than the battalion column and the line. All idea of further exposing troops in any kind of close formation to enemy gunfire was abandoned, and on the German side, all subsequent fighting was conducted only in those compact bodies of skirmishers into which the columns had so far regularly dissolved of themselves under a deadly hail of bullets, although this had been opposed by the higher commands as contrary to order. And in the same way, the only form of movement when under fire from enemy rifles became the double. Once again, the soldier had been shrewder than the officer. It was he who instinctively found the only way of fighting, which has proved of service up to now, under the fire of breech-loading rifles, and in spite of opposition from his officers, he carried it through successfully. The Franco-German War marked a turning point of entirely new implications. In the first place, the weapons used have reached such a stage of perfection that further progress, which would have any revolutionizing influence, is no longer possible. Once armies have guns which can hit a battalion at any range at which it can be distinguished, and rifles which are equally effective for hitting individual men, while loading them takes less time than aiming, then all further improvements are of minor importance for field warfare. The era of evolution is therefore, in essentials, closed in this direction. And secondly, this war has compelled all continental powers to introduce in a stricter form the Prussian Landwehr system, and with it a military burden which must bring them to ruin within a few years. The army has become the main purpose of the state, and an end in itself. The peoples are there only to provide soldiers and feed them. Militarism dominates and is swallowing Europe. But this militarism also bears within itself the seed of its own destruction. Competition among the individual states forces them on the one hand to spend more money each year on the army and navy, artillery, etc., thus more and more hastening their financial collapse, and on the other hand to resort to universal compulsory military service more and more extensively, thus in the long run making the whole people familiar with the use of arms, and therefore enabling them at a given moment to make their will prevail against the warlords in command. And this moment will arrive as soon as the mass of the people, town and country workers and peasants, will have a will. At this point, the armies of the princes become transformed into armies of the people. The machine refuses to work, and militarism collapses by the dialectics of its own evolution. What the bourgeois democracy of 1848 could not accomplish, just because it was bourgeois and not proletarian, namely to give the laboring masses a will whose content would be in accord with their class position, socialism will infallibly secure. And this will mean the bursting asunder from within of militarism and with it of all standing armies. That is the first moral of our history of modern infantry. The second moral, which brings us back again to Herr Göring, is that the whole organization and method of warfare of the armies, and along with these victory or defeat, proved to be dependent on material, that is, on economic conditions, on the human material and the armaments, and therefore on the quality and quantity of the population and on technical development. Only a hunting people like the Americans could rediscover skirmishing tactics, and they were hunters as a result of purely economic causes, just as now, as a result of purely economic causes, these same Yankees of the old states have transformed themselves into farmers, industrialists, seamen, and merchants, who no longer skirmish in the primeval forests, but instead, all the more effectively, in the field of speculation, where they have likewise made much progress in making use of large masses. Only a revolution such as the French, which brought about the economic emancipation of the bourgeois, and especially of the peasant, could find the mass armies, and at the same time the free forms of movement which shattered the old rigid lines, the military counterparts of the absolutism which they were defending. And we have seen in case after case how advances in technique, as soon as they become applicable militarily, and in fact were so applied, immediately and almost forcibly produced changes and even revolutions in the methods of warfare, often indeed against the will of the army command. And nowadays, any zealous NCO could explain to Herr Göring how greatly, besides, the conduct of a war depends on the productivity and means of communication of the army's own hinterland, as well as of the theater of war. In short, always and everywhere, it is the economic conditions and the instruments of economic power which help force to victory, without which force ceases to be force. And anyone who tried to reform methods of warfare from the opposite standpoint, on the basis of Deringian principles, would certainly earn nothing but a beating. If we pass now from land to sea, we find that in the last 20 years alone, an even more complete revolution has taken place there. The warship of the Crimean War was the wooden 2- and 3-decker of 60 to 100 guns. This was still mainly propelled by sail, with only a low-powered auxiliary steam engine. The guns on these warships were for the most part 32-pounders, weighing approximately 50 centners, with only a few 68-pounders weighing 95 centners. Towards the end of the war, ironclad floating batteries made their appearance. They were clumsy and almost immobile monsters, but to the guns of that period they were invulnerable. Soon warships, too, were swathed in iron armor plating. At first the plates were still thin, a thickness of 4 inches being regarded as extremely heavy armor. But soon the progress made with artillery outstripped the armor plating. Each successive increase in the strength of the armor used was countered by a new and heavier gun which easily pierced the plates. In this way, we have already reached armor plating 10, 12, 14, and 24 inches thick. Italy proposes to have a ship built with plates 3 feet thick, on the one hand, and on the other, rifled guns of 25, 35, 80, and even 100 tons, at 20 centners in weight, which can hurl projectiles weighing 300, 400, 1,700, and up to 2,000 pounds, to distances which were never dreamed of before. The warship of the present day is a gigantic armored screw-driven steamer of 8,000 to 9,000 tons displacement and 6,000 to 8,000 horsepower, with revolving turrets and 4 or at most 6 heavy guns, the bow being extended underwater into a ram for running down enemy vessels. It is a single colossal machine, in which steam not only drives the ship at high speed, but also works the steering gear, raises the anchor, swings the turrets, changes the elevation of the guns and loads them, pumps out water, hoists and lowers the boats, some of which are themselves also steam-driven, and so forth. And the rivalry between armor plating and the firepower of guns is so far from being at an end that nowadays a ship is almost always not up to requirements, already out of date before it's launched. The modern warship is not only a product, but at the same time a specimen of modern large-scale industry, a floating factory, producing mainly, to be sure, a lavish waste of money. The country in which large-scale industry is most highly developed has almost a monopoly of the construction of these ships. All Turkish, almost all Russian, and most German armored vessels have been built in England. Armor plates that are at all serviceable are hardly made outside of Sheffield. Of the 3 steelworks in Europe which alone are able to make the heaviest guns, 2, Woolwich and Elswick, are in England, and the 3rd, Krupp, in Germany. In this sphere, it is most palpably evident that the, quote, direct political force, which according to Herr Düring is the, quote, decisive cause of the economic situation, is on the contrary completely subordinate to the economic situation, that not only the construction but also the operation of the marine instrument of force, the warship, has itself become a branch of modern large-scale industry. And that this is so distresses no one more than force itself, that is, the state, which has now to pay for one ship as much as a whole small fleet used to cost, which has to resign itself to seeing these expensive vessels become obsolete, and therefore worthless, even before they slide into the water, and which must certainly be just as disgusted as Herr Düring that the man of the economic situation, the engineer, is now of far greater importance on board than the man of direct force, the captain. We, on the contrary, have absolutely no cause to be vexed when we see that, in this competitive struggle between armor plating and guns, the warship is being developed to a pitch of perfection, which is making it both outrageously costly and unusable in war, and that the struggle makes manifest also in the sphere of naval warfare those inherent dialectical laws of motion, on the basis of which militarism, like every other historical phenomenon, is being brought to its doom in consequence of its own development. Here, too, therefore, we see absolutely clearly that it is not by any means true that, quote, the primary must be sought in direct political force and not in any indirect economic power, unquote. On the contrary, for what in fact does the primary in force itself prove to be? Economic power, the disposal of the means of power of large-scale industry. Naval political force, which reposes on modern warships, proves to be not at all direct, but on the contrary mediated by economic power. Highly developed metallurgy, command of skilled technicians, and highly productive coal mines. And yet, what is the use of it all? If we put Herr Düring in supreme command in the next naval war, he will destroy all fleets of armored ships, which are the slaves of the economic situation, without torpedoes or any other artifices, solely by virtue of his direct force. That's the end of the chapter. So, I didn't really add any comments to this one. I don't really think they're needed. I think that this section, like the previous chapter, was pretty much self-explanatory, especially if you're listening to this near the end of the basic Marxism-Leninism study guide, where a lot of these concepts will have been developed to some extent previously. But as always, if you have a question, leave it in the comments and we'll go from there.